My name is Cal Deering. I'm 41 years old. I'm about 30 pounds overweight from 9 years of sitting in government offices eating vending machine food. I need reading glasses, and I keep losing them. And I have a bad left knee that I blew out on a hiking trip in my early 30s that never fully healed because I put off the physical therapy, the way you put off everything you mean to do, and somehow never get to. I used to work for the federal government, coordinating emergency broadcast infrastructure across a 4-state region. Before that, I did field work, actual antenna installation, tower climbing, transmitter maintenance. Before that, I went to college for electrical engineering and was told I had a good head for systems. What I had, mainly, was an inability to stop noticing when things weren't working right. Signal degradation that shouldn't be there. Interference patterns that didn't match any known source. Frequencies that behaved in ways that made me want to start asking questions nobody around me was interested in answering. It's a useful quality in a diagnostic engineer, and an exhausting quality in a human being who has to share a planet with other human beings who would prefer not to be told everything they're doing slightly wrong. I was divorced at 36. Mostly my fault. I wasn't bad to her. I want to be clear about that, if anyone's listening. I wasn't unkind. I was just absent. Not physically, I was right there. I was absent the way a radio tower is absent when it's not transmitting. The structure is there. The wires are there, but nothing's coming out of it. She figured this out before I did, and had the sense to leave. I didn't argue. I told myself I'd fix it. I didn't fix it. She remarried 2 years later, and I got a Christmas card for 3 years. And then nothing. I'm telling you this because it matters to why I bought the station. I want you to understand, whoever you are, if you're out there, that I didn't buy this place as some kind of survivalist move. I didn't stockpile weapons or run drills. I bought it because I had $63,000 in savings, a paid-off car, and absolutely no vision for the rest of my life. And then I found a listing for an abandoned FM broadcast station at 7,200 feet elevation in the Colorado mountains that had been sitting empty for 4 years because the previous owner had let the license lapse and nobody wanted the headache of the access road. The access road is a disaster, by the way. 3.4 miles of switchback gravel with a soft shoulder that drops 12 feet on the west side and no guardrail for the last mile. First time I drove it, I gripped the steering wheel so hard I left palm prints in the rubber covering. Second time was better. Third time I figured out you had to treat it like a conversation. Gradual, attentive, never assume you know what's coming next. The property itself is a concrete block building, maybe 1,800 square feet, with a separate equipment shed, about 40 feet north of the main structure. 2 towers, one tall one, 40 feet, for the main antenna array, and one shorter backup that the previous owner never finished installing. Inside, a main broadcast console that was state-of-the-art in 2006 and is merely functional now. A secondary monitoring panel, a server rack with equipment I'm still inventorying, a bathroom with a shower that runs cold because the water heater pilot keeps going out, a small kitchen that's really just a counter with a 2-burner propane stove and a miniature refrigerator, a storage room that someone used as a secondary office at some point, and then abandoned mid-project, and a back room that I've been using as a sleeping area, even though it wasn't designed for sleeping, and the ceiling has a crack in it that drips when it rains hard. There's a basement. More on that later. The asking price was $47,000. I paid $43,500 after pointing out that the antenna cable on the main tower had been improperly spliced in 3 places, and the splice joints were starting to corrode. The seller, a property management company representing the estate of the original owner, did not really know what antenna cable splice joints were, and agreed to the price reduction mostly to end the conversation. I moved in with a truck full of tools, a generator I'd brought from my previous apartment, because I knew mountain power could be unreliable, 400 pounds of canned food, and dry goods that I'd bought at a warehouse store in Denver, because the nearest grocery was 40 minutes down the mountain, and a very specific plan for the next 12 months. I was going to spend 6 months restoring the equipment to operational standard. Then I was going to apply for a new broadcast license. Then I was going to run a regional emergency information station. Weather, road conditions, community alerts, funded by a small number of local business advertisements, and possibly a public media grant I'd already started drafting the application for. It was, objectively, a reasonable plan. Not exciting, not going to make me rich, but reasonable, and mine, and achievable by one person who knew what they were doing, which was exactly the kind of thing I needed after 11 years of being one cog in a machine that was mostly interested in grinding things smooth. I had 14 days of good work before everything stopped. The first 12 were genuinely fine. I drove to town twice for supplies. I got the backup generator sorted. It needed a carburetor clean and a new fuel filter, which is a half-day job if you know what you're doing. I patched 2 of the 3 antenna cable splices and ordered the connectors for the third. I got the shortwave monitoring equipment running so I could listen to the full band while I worked, which is a thing I do out of habit. Background audio. The way some people need a podcast or music, I need the hiss and chatter of the radio spectrum to think clearly. That background noise is where the first weird thing happened. Day 11. I was under the main console replacing a corroded ground strap, flat on my back on the dusty floor, and I had the shortwave on low, scanning slow across the HF band the way I always do, and I noticed interference on a frequency that should have been quiet. Not dramatic interference, not the kind that makes you sit up and grab the tuning knob, just a low-frequency pulse, almost regular, coming through on a part of the spectrum that civilian traffic doesn't use much. Military adjacent, not military exactly. More like someone was using a frequency allocation near a military band, and either didn't know the rules or didn't care. I wrote it in my log. FRQ 5847 kHz, 1423 local. Pulsed interference, irregular pattern, source unknown, signal strength 3/9. I noted it and moved on. That's what you do. You note it and move on. Anomalies are everywhere in the spectrum. Half of them are explained by things as boring as a badly shielded industrial motor. You note them and keep working. Day 12, same thing. Same frequency, same time of day, stronger. Signal strength 5/9. That's enough to be interesting. I spent about 20 minutes trying to get a bearing on it using the directional capability of my secondary antenna, which, again, wasn't fully set up yet, so this was imprecise. And what I got was a direction that pointed roughly northeast, which, at this elevation and with the terrain between here and anywhere, could mean 100 different things. I wrote it in the log. Repeated anomaly same frequency. Bearing northeast, est. 5,200 kilometer range. Will monitor. Day 13. I was on the access road coming back from a supply run, and I got a push notification from a news app on my phone. I barely had signal out here. The nearest cell tower was close enough to get 1 bar of LTE if I stood in the right spot near the main gate. But news notifications sometimes came through in bursts when I was on the lower part of the road. The notification said, breaking. Emergency services overwhelmed in multiple Denver metro areas. Mass casualty events reported. Officials urging shelter in place. I read it twice. Then I drove the rest of the road home and opened my laptop and tried to get more information. But the satellite internet connection I'd been using, a consumer-grade dish I'd mounted on the equipment shed, was slow, and the news sites I was trying to reach were loading in pieces or not at all. I got enough to understand there were violent incidents happening in the city. Multiple locations, hospitals at capacity, 911 systems backed up. I got the words attack and multiple assailants and unusual aggression, and then the connection dropped and didn't come back. I sat at the console for a long time. The shortwave was on. I was scanning manually, slowly, looking for emergency frequencies. NOAA weather was normal. Amateur bands were getting busy. I could hear ham operators talking, short-clipped conversations, people asking other people what they knew. Coast Guard frequencies were quiet. Commercial aviation was normal, no deviation from standard chatter. I found one thing. On 155.340 MHz, which is a frequency used by a lot of rural emergency services in Colorado, I caught the tail end of a conversation between what sounded like a county sheriff's dispatcher and a field unit. The field unit was saying something I couldn't quite make out. The signal was weak and there was noise. And then the dispatcher came in clear and said, All available units. Be advised, State Patrol is requesting you prioritize scene containment rather than individual pursuit. Repeat, containment, not pursuit. Do not engage isolated individuals unless they are actively threatening life safety. Containment, not pursuit. I wrote that in my log. Then I went to the storage room and spent an hour inventorying what I actually had for supplies. 412 cans of various things: beans, vegetables, soups, tuna, 2 20-pound bags of rice, 1 20-pound bag of dried lentils, 3 5-gallon jugs of water I'd filled in town as a habit, plus a water filtration setup I'd bought because the property has a cistern fed by a small spring, and I'd planned to use it eventually. Propane, 2 full 100-pound cylinders that I'd gotten specifically for the heater and stove, plus 3 smaller camping canisters. Tool inventory, full set of hand tools, a good multimeter, wire and connectors and electrical tape and everything you need to work on broadcast equipment. 2 gas cans, both full, 5 gallons each, that I'd gotten for the backup generator. Battery bank, I had a 48-volt lithium battery bank I'd bought second-hand from a solar installation company that had gone under, about 12 kilowatt-hours capacity. I'd been planning to connect it to a small solar array as part of the station's backup power plan. The solar panels were still in boxes in the equipment shed. I hadn't gotten to them yet. Medical first aid kit I'd brought from my apartment that I'd never used, 3 bottles of ibuprofen, 2 bottles of acetaminophen, a bottle of prescription antibiotic I had left over from a dental abscess 2 years ago, 8 pills left, 1 bottle of prescription blood pressure medication that, I'll be honest, I'd been skipping more than I should. I made a list. I looked at the list. I thought about what the dispatcher had said. I thought about the interference on 5847 kilohertz. I thought about all the years I'd spent in emergency communications, all the drills and the protocols, and the theoretical frameworks. And I thought about how in all of those years, no one had ever actually explained what you do when the emergency isn't a contained incident in one place, but is instead everywhere at once. I turned off the kitchen light. I went to the console. I started scanning every frequency I could reach. That was day 13. Day 14. The world more or less ended. I want to describe what it sounds like to listen to a catastrophe on the radio. Not the visuals. I don't have visuals. I have a small TV that I haven't bothered to hook to anything. I have a laptop with intermittent satellite internet. And I have windows that look down a mountain into a valley that, during the day, shows me a small town called Ridgecrest, and the highway and the forest, and at night shows me lights or the absence of lights. What I have, primarily, is the radio. What a catastrophe sounds like on the radio is, first, confusion. Not screaming, confusion. People calling in and saying things like, "We're not sure what we're seeing," and reports are conflicting. Dispatchers who are professionally calm becoming slightly less professionally calm. A frequency that usually handles, say, 20 calls per hour handling 200, and you can hear it in the gaps, in the brief silences between transmissions, where usually there's a pause, but now there's nothing, because the queue is full. Then the confusion shifts into something else. The voices get shorter. The professional language starts breaking down at the edges. Someone on a Denver metro frequency says, and I wrote this down exactly, "These people don't respond to commands, at all. I'm telling you, they're not responding to anything." Someone else says, we had to physically, and then the transmission cuts and doesn't come back. On the amateur bands, by noon on day 14, the ham operators were becoming a significant source of information. Some of them were panicking and broadcasting that panic, which was not useful. But some of them were doing exactly what ham operators are trained to do in emergencies. Calm, methodical, passing information from one node to the next. I was listening to a net that had formed on 1430 megahertz, which is a well-known international distress calling frequency, and the people on it were building a picture, piece by piece. The picture was multiple cities simultaneously, not just Denver. Chicago and Indianapolis had reports before Denver. Minneapolis. Something in the Pacific Northwest. Someone saying they had a contact in Charlotte, and the contact had stopped responding 3 hours ago. Something about that simultaneous aspect stuck in my engineer's head. Real things, real emergencies, natural disasters, infrastructure failures, spread. They start in one place and radiate outward. They follow geography. They follow population density. They follow the paths of least resistance. What these people were describing didn't sound like spreading. It sounded like ignition. Multiple points at once. I didn't know what to do with that. I filed it in the part of my brain where I put things I notice and can't explain, and moved on, because there were immediate things that needed attention. First, the access road. I drove down it at around 2 in the afternoon on day 14, just to the first gate. There's a chain link gate about half a mile down that was part of the property, an old security installation from when the station was active, and I'd been meaning to get a better padlock for it. I had a padlock on it, just not a good one. I went down and I swapped it out for a heavy-duty one I'd brought back from my last supply run, because even before I knew what was happening, I'd had the instinct that I might want the road controlled. Standing at the gate, I could see the highway. The highway was not right. There was too much traffic moving in one direction, away from town, toward the city, and then there was too much traffic stopped. Cars pulled over. Cars that had been in accidents and not moved. I could see, maybe 2 miles down, what I thought was smoke. I went back to the station. I locked the main building. I checked the equipment shed and locked it too. I filled every container I could find with water from the spring cistern, because I didn't know yet whether the cistern would keep running if power went out. Then I sat down and kept listening. By 6 in the evening, NOAA weather radio started running an emergency alert. I've heard thousands of emergency alerts in my career, watched them being tested, helped calibrate the systems that delivered them, written documentation about their use. Hearing one that wasn't a test was strange, in a way I find hard to describe. The tone, that 2-tone attention signal, 853 Hz and 960 Hz alternating, and then the automated voice giving the message, which said, essentially, seek shelter immediately. Do not approach individuals who appear disoriented or aggressive. Do not attempt to render aid without protective equipment. Await further government guidance. Await further government guidance. I had to stop for a minute with that one, because I know how emergency alert systems work. I know what the protocols say. And await further government guidance is what you say when you don't have further guidance yet. It's a placeholder phrase. It means we are still figuring this out, and we didn't want to leave dead air. Fine. Okay. I could work with that. I made a cup of coffee. Propane stove. The electric kettle was for grid power that I hadn't confirmed was still running. And I sat at the console, and I made a decision. The decision was, I am going to treat this like a long-duration grid-down scenario. I have the equipment and the supplies to be useful here. I am not going to panic. I am going to be systematic. The first systematic thing I did was build a frequency log. A complete one, not the spot logging I'd been doing. I went through every frequency range I could access with the equipment I had, and I noted what was on it, what the signal strength was, what the content was. This took about 3 hours. By 9 at night, I had a picture. Military frequencies were active, but encoded, above my ability to decode without specialized equipment I don't have. I could hear that there was traffic, not what it said. FEMA emergency management channels were active, some of them in plain language, and from those I got the clearest official picture. The situation was nationwide. It was not under control, and they were deploying National Guard units to population centers. The phrase containment perimeter came up multiple times. Amateur ham operators were now an extensive informal news network covering everything from neighborhood-level reports to what sounded like real-time observations from people in affected areas. And then there were the other things. Things I wasn't supposed to be able to hear but could, because of my equipment and elevation, and some knowledge of where to look. But I'll get to those. The first night, alone, I slept for maybe 3 hours, and spent the rest of the time at the console. I'd eaten a can of soup, and half a sleeve of crackers. My coffee had gone cold twice. Outside, the mountain was quiet. In a way, mountains are always quiet, which is not silent. Wind, the creak of the antenna cable in the cold. Once what I was pretty sure was an elk moving through the scrub on the north side of the building. but quiet in the way that means nothing human. Nothing moving on the road. Nothing moving in the trees below. It was the quietest I'd been since I moved in. There's something very wrong about that in retrospect. Second night of the world ending. First full day of trying to figure out what I was doing. Let me tell you what the mountain looks like in October. The aspen stands had mostly gone yellow. They go yellow all at once. A fact that I'd learned about a week after I moved in. And it's not gradual the way you'd expect. It's like someone flipped a switch and suddenly every aspen on the slope is the same bright yellow, almost synthetic looking. By now most of the leaves were down. The forest above the tree line was bare rock and scrub grass that had gone brown, and above that was the ridge. And above the ridge on clear days, you could see the higher peaks to the west with their first snow. Below me, the valley. Below the valley, the highway. I had binoculars, not great ones, the kind you buy at a sporting goods store because they look useful, but functional. First morning, I stood at the south-facing window and looked down at the town of Ridgecrest. The town of Ridgecrest has about 2,000 people. Gas station, diner, hardware store, a small grocery, a school, a clinic with 2 doctors, a fire department that shares a building with the sheriff's substation. I'd been there 5 times. Bought hardware, bought propane, ate a disappointing breakfast at the diner once. Nice town. Quiet. What I was seeing through the binoculars was not what I'd expect of a nice quiet town. There was still smoke. A building on the east side was burning, and nobody was fighting it. The main street, which I could see maybe a third of from this angle, had a dozen or so vehicles stopped in it. Not parked, stopped. The way vehicles stop when something happens while they're moving. I could see some figures moving in the street, but not enough to tell me what was happening. From 3 miles up and away, with 8x magnification, people are very small. I went back to the radio. That's what I kept doing. Radio, window, radio, window. The radio told me more than the window. The radio told me that whatever this was, it was contagious, and the mechanism of contagion was a bite. It told me that infected individuals showed loss of rational behavior and extreme aggression, but were still mobile and physically functional. It told me, from the amateur operators describing what they were seeing, that these individuals did not respond to pain or verbal commands. They moved towards sound. They bit. They didn't do much else. That last part, the toward sound thing, is what made the mountain important, not just the elevation. The elevation means the one road up here is 3 miles long and clearly visible and easy to watch. But the sound thing means that up here, where the wind swallows noise, where my footsteps on gravel can't be heard from 30 feet away in the right conditions, the basic physics of the situation were working in my favor. I was a systems engineer. I thought in systems. And this mountain, the building, the equipment, the topography, this was a system I could work with. But I needed to shore up a lot of things first. Day 2 of the outbreak. I'm going to call it Day 2 even though it didn't start on a specific morning. It started on the afternoon of Day 14 and rolled into night and then into the next morning. Day 2. I started making decisions about the building. The main building is concrete block. That's a good thing. The walls are 8 inches thick, and they're not going to flex or break from anything short of a vehicle impact. The windows are a weakness. There are 6 of them, 2 on the south face, 1 on the north, 2 on the west, 1 small frosted one on the east in the bathroom. They're single pane and they're old and they're held in aluminum frames that have corroded around the corners. Not easy to break from outside, but not impossible either. I had no plywood. I hadn't thought about boarding windows when I moved in, because why would I? I did have sheet metal in the equipment shed, corrugated steel panels that the previous owner had used for various repairs and left stacked against the north wall. I spent the morning of Day 2 measuring windows and measuring metal and figuring out how to make that work. It took almost the whole day. I had a metal cutting disc for my angle grinder, and I used it to size the panels, and I used lag bolts and a cordless impact driver to secure them over the south-facing windows from the inside. Metal against the frame, flush, 2 rows of bolts. I left gaps at the top of each one, about 1.5 inches, which let light in and let me hear from that direction without having to open anything. The west windows I did the same way. The north window I left uncovered for now because nothing approached from the north. The ridge was up there, no road, just terrain. The door situation. One main entrance on the south face, solid steel door with a decent deadbolt that was already part of the building. One back door on the north face, hollow core steel, much less confidence-inspiring. I spent an hour reinforcing the back door with a bar bracket I made from a length of angle iron I had in the shed, welded it to a plate, lag-bolted the plate to the concrete block frame. That door was not opening from outside without a vehicle. Main entrance. The deadbolt was fine, but the frame was the weak point. Whoever installed it had done a lousy job. The strike plate was mounted with screws that only went an inch into the wooden framing within the concrete block assembly. I pulled those out and replaced them with 3-inch screws that went all the way through the wood and into the block. Better. Water. The spring-fed cistern is outside, about 30 feet from the north face of the building. Concrete tank, partially buried, lid that bolts down. The feed line runs underground to the building and comes up under the kitchen counter. I'd checked it. The spring was running. The tank was full, probably 300 gallons. Enough for a long time if I was conservative. But I didn't want to trust a single supply point. I dug out the water filtration system I'd bought, a gravity filter rated for 8 gallons per hour, uses replaceable ceramic elements, and set it up in the kitchen. From now on, even the cistern water would go through that. I also collected every container I could find and filled them. Buckets, a large plastic tote from the storage room, an old 5-gallon water cooler bottle that had been in the equipment shed. By end of day 2, I had maybe 120 gallons stored inside, plus whatever was in the cistern. Food. Not worrying about food yet. What I had would last one person 6 months or more, if I was careful and not at all picky. And I'm not picky. I lived alone for 5 years, eating mainly canned soups and rice, and whatever produce I grabbed at the gas station on the way home from work. This was an upgrade. Generator. This was important. The backup generator I'd brought from my apartment ran on gasoline and was not efficient. Maybe 8 hours on 5 gallons at the load I needed to run the radio equipment. I had 10 gallons. That was 80 hours roughly. Not enough. The equipment shed had what I needed though. The main station had originally been connected to the grid, and when the grid was unreliable, which apparently it had been, this far up the mountain, the previous owner had run on a propane generator. The propane generator was in the shed. It had not been run in 4 years. It needed work. I spent the 3rd day, the real day 3 of me being on lockdown, on that generator. Drained the old fuel, which had varnished in the carburetor exactly the way I expected. Cleaned the carb, checked the spark plugs, checked the oil, checked the fuel solenoid valve. By late afternoon I had it running. Badly. Like an old dog that doesn't want to get up in the morning. By the next morning, after letting it warm up and settle, it was running clean. I connected it to the main panel through the transfer switch that was already installed. The previous owner had done that part right, at least, and confirmed it would power the broadcast equipment, the lights I needed, and one electric space heater. Everything else I left off the circuit. The propane tanks were 100 pounds each, 2 of them, and a generator this size at this load would use them slowly. Months. At conservative operation. I ran it only when I needed to charge the battery bank or run specific equipment, and let the battery handle the passive load between runs. By day 4 I had power that I controlled. Water from 2 sources with filtration. Food for months. A building with reinforced entry points and covered windows. Radio equipment running. What I didn't have was any idea what was happening below the mountain, beyond what I was piecing together from the radio. And I didn't have any human contact. And I hadn't slept properly in 4 days, and my back hurt from sleeping on the equipment room floor. I'd given up on the back room when the rain came and the ceiling crack started dripping on night 3, and I'd burned my forearm on the generator exhaust and hadn't been paying enough attention to it, and the world was ending. I was, objectively, doing fine. I was also in a constant low-level state of something that wasn't quite fear, but was adjacent to it. Like the feeling before a thunderstorm, that pressure change, that sense of something large and close that you can't quite locate. Nights were the worst for that. Let me tell you about nights up here. Even before all of this, nights were different. The first week I was here, I'd step outside after dark and the sky was just wrong by city standards. Too many stars, for one thing. Too much depth. You could see the Milky Way, which I don't think I'd actually seen properly since I was a kid at my uncle's place in Nebraska. And it was disorienting in a way I didn't expect. Not beautiful disorienting, but scale disorienting. The kind of thing that makes your footing feel uncertain. And the sounds. Elk, sometimes. Wind through the antenna guys. The creak of the main tower when the temperature dropped fast, the way metal does when it cools unevenly. Wildlife. I'd heard what I was pretty sure was a mountain lion once. A sound like a scream that came from the ridge and then was just gone. And it had pulled me out of a dead sleep, and I'd sat there for 20 minutes holding a flashlight before I went back to sleep. After the outbreak, nights got a different kind of wrong. On the fourth night, I heard the crowd again. That's the only way I can describe it. Not individual voices, not gunshots, not anything I could name separately. Just that aggregate sound of too many people making noise below. It was fainter than the first time, or I was more accustomed to it. I don't know which. I sat at the window with the 1-inch gap in the metal panel and I looked down at the valley, and I counted lights. There were fewer than the first time. The gas station I could see from here was dark. One cluster of lights, maybe residential, was still on. Something orange was pulsing in the far eastern edge of the valley that might have been a fire, or might have been a floodlight on a generator somewhere. At some point, maybe midnight, maybe 1, I started hearing something closer. Not the crowd sound from the valley, something on the road. I turned off every light in the building. I sat still for probably 10 minutes. Then I went to the narrow gap in the south-facing window panel and looked down the access road. I couldn't see anything specific. The moon was partial, and the tree cover on the upper part of the road broke the light into patches. I listened. Wind. The antenna cable. My own breathing. And then, footsteps. Or what sounded like footsteps. Not organized. Not a single clear set of footsteps. Multiple. Shuffling. The kind of sound made by someone who isn't watching where they put their feet. And also not hurrying. And also probably not cold even though it was 40 degrees out. I stayed at the gap for a long time. They were on the road, I was fairly certain. But moving slowly. Very slowly. Maybe they'd seen the lights before I turned them off, and were moving toward where the lights had been. Maybe they were following sound, and the generator I'd run earlier had been audible from down below. I didn't know. What I knew was, the gate was locked. The gate was chain link and was not a serious barrier. You could climb it in 30 seconds. But these things, from everything I'd heard, didn't climb. They moved toward sound and they bit, and they didn't do much else. A chain link gate wasn't going to stop a motivated person. But they weren't motivated in that way. They were motivated by stimulus. So I made no sound. I turned nothing on. I sat in the dark for 2 hours. At some point, the footsteps stopped. I didn't hear them leave. I don't know if they went back down or wandered into the trees. By the time enough light came in through the window gaps that I felt able to move quietly to the door and check, there was nothing visible on the road. I found scuff marks on the gravel near the gate the next morning. Multiple sets, overlapping. They'd been at the gate and then either gone back or wandered around it into the tree line. I spent that day, day 5, moving every loose piece of metal sheeting and old equipment I could find to form a rough secondary barrier inside the gate. Not a wall, just a maze. Enough noise to be heard from the building if something came through at night. Trip hazard obstacles that would slow movement and generate sound. I also pulled out the old passive alarm system the previous owner had half installed and never finished. Motion detectors connected to a control panel, with sensors that were meant to protect the transmitter equipment from vandalism. The sensors were still in their packages. I spent most of day 5 finishing that installation, running cable through the conduit that was already in place, getting the sensors positioned to cover the gate area and the equipment shed. When the system triggered, an alarm would sound inside the main building. Not a loud external alarm. I didn't want that. An internal buzzer, like a doorbell I could hear only from inside. I got it working by late afternoon. Tested it myself by walking through the sensor field. Buzzer. Good. I ate a can of lentil soup and some crackers and thought about what I was building here, what it was becoming. I'd bought a radio station. 14 days ago, I was thinking about broadcast license applications and advertising revenue and whether I could get a decent weather data feed. Now I was wiring motion sensors and reinforcing doors and rationing propane. The thing that I kept coming back to, though, was the radio. Because the radio was doing something I hadn't fully processed yet. The radio was making me useful. Here's what I was doing with the equipment by the end of that first week. I'd pulled together everything that could receive. The main monitoring panel, which covered AM and FM broadcast bands plus the VHF public safety frequencies. The shortwave receiver, which was my best piece of equipment and could cover 2 to 30 megahertz with good sensitivity. A handheld scanner I'd had since my government days that I'd brought along more out of habit than planning, which could cover the UHF range, including a lot of local emergency services, and a military surplus HF radio, not the transmitter, just the receiver section, that I'd bought years ago at a surplus sale and never fully set up because I hadn't had the space. I set it up in the equipment shed initially, but then moved it inside. It was old but solid, and could cover some frequencies the civilian equipment couldn't reach as well. I was building a listening post, a comprehensive picture of the electromagnetic spectrum between 500 kilohertz and 500 megahertz. That sounds more impressive than it is. It's just what you get when you have the right equipment and the patience to tune through it methodically. What I was hearing, organized by source, military, still encoded mostly. But I found something interesting on day 6. There was traffic on 4.724 megahertz that was sometimes not fully encrypted. Either a unit in the field with a radio that had a degraded encryption module, or someone who didn't realize their radio wasn't encrypting properly, or someone who didn't care anymore. The traffic was fragmented. I could hear 2 or 3 words and then encoded segments. But what I got was enough to know that there were military units positioned at something they called the Clearfield Line, which I had no map reference for, and that they were discussing resource allocation, not active engagement. FEMA, emergency management, a mixed picture. The organized response frequencies were getting quieter over the week, not louder. That's backwards from how an escalating emergency is supposed to work. In a real managed disaster, you'd expect communications traffic to increase as more resources come online. The fact that I was hearing more silence, more gaps, more interrupted transmissions that didn't resume, that was telling me something about the actual state of the organized response that I didn't want to sit with too long. Ham amateur operators, these were becoming the backbone of what I knew. A network had formed. People call it the Emergency Ham Network, though I never heard an official name for it. It was just people who had equipment and were using it. They were relaying information between regions. I found a regular net on 7.290 megahertz that ran 3 times a day and had check-ins from people across the state and beyond. I started listening to every session. From the Hamnet, I learned Denver was largely overrun. The phrase used was not navigable. Major highways were blocked with abandoned and crashed vehicles. Pockets of survivors in structures. National Guard had established a perimeter, but it was porous and moving. Colorado Springs was in similar shape. Fort Carson had apparently gone on full lockdown. No one knew what was happening inside. Small towns were mixed. Some had done well. Places with tight community organization. Places where people knew their neighbors. Places with natural defensive geography. Some had gone the way of the cities. The radio stations themselves, the commercial broadcast stations I was monitoring, were going off the air one by one. It wasn't a decision, I don't think. It was just that the people who ran them left, or couldn't maintain power, or stopped showing up. By day 7, I was monitoring 3 commercial stations that were still broadcasting in a region that had had dozens. One was running automated music with no live DJ, which is what you get when a station's computer system keeps going, but the humans are gone. One was a local news station in a city I won't name that had a single live voice. Woman, young, professional, getting less professional as the days went on, reading whatever information she could gather. I listened to her every time she broadcast. One was a religious station running continuous recorded programming. I wasn't broadcasting yet myself. I had transmission capability. The main console, once I'd gotten the antenna connections right, could push a pretty strong FM signal from this elevation, and with some adjustment, I could also use the HF equipment to transmit shortwave, but I hadn't used it. Partly because I wasn't sure what I'd say. Partly because I knew that broadcasting means advertising your presence, and I was still sorting out what my presence here was. But I was sitting on a decision that kept getting closer. Day 8 of the outbreak, first contact. I heard a vehicle on the road. The motion sensor wasn't going off, which meant either the vehicle had gone around the gate somehow, or my sensor placement had a gap. I heard the engine, old engine, diesel, rough idle, coming up the lower section of the road. I went to the south window gap and watched. It was a truck, old Ford, mid-90s, lifted slightly, with a rack on top that had what looked like a kayak, and some gear bungeed to it. It came up the road slowly, which told me the driver had been on this road before, or was smart enough to treat switchbacks with respect. When it got to the gate, it stopped. I watched. The driver's door opened and a person got out. Male, looked young, wearing a jacket that was too light for the temperature, carrying nothing visible. He walked to the gate and looked at the padlock, and then looked up toward the building. He called out something I couldn't quite hear. Decision point. Everything I'd read and heard about survivor dynamics, and I'd been reading a lot, from ham operators describing what they were seeing in the towns below, said that who you opened your door to in the early days was a decision that compounded. You let in the wrong person. You created problems. You let in the right person. Maybe you had an ally and another pair of hands. I looked at him through the binoculars. Young, maybe late 20s. He looked exhausted. He was alone as far as I could see. The truck had gear on top, which suggested planning, not panic. He'd come up a mountain access road to a locked gate, which meant he'd been looking for something specific, or at least looking for elevation. He called out again, and this time I caught it. Hello? Anybody up there? I can see the building. I can see you've got power. I'm not a threat. I just need to talk to someone. I need to talk to someone. I don't know why that specifically got to me. Maybe because I'd been alone for 8 days and had been pretending I was fine with it. I took the radio, the handheld one, and I tried a frequency, 146.520, which is the standard ham simplex calling frequency that anybody with a hand radio in the field should know. It was a shot in the dark. He might have a radio. He might not. Vehicle at the gate, I said into it. Are you on this frequency? There was about 5 seconds of silence, and then his radio clicked. I could hear the squelch break from the direction of the gate, even at this distance. And he said, Yeah, I'm here. Are you the one who's been running power up on this hill? That's me. How many in your vehicle? Just me. There's nobody else. What do you want? I don't know. Honestly, I was heading west and the highway there are too many of them on the highway. I came up the forest road and then I saw your building and I just thought. He stopped. Then, is it okay if I just park somewhere? I don't need to come in. I just don't want to be on the road tonight. I thought about it. The motion sensor. I realized the gap was that I'd only covered the immediate gate area. The road below the sensor point was not covered, so he'd gotten past it without triggering it. I needed to fix that. Stay at the gate, I told him. I'll come down. I came down armed with the most useful defensive tool I had, which was a large, heavy adjustable wrench and a can of wasp spray, because I did not own a gun and had not owned one, and had previously considered that a reasonable position. I reconsidered it every 5 minutes for the entire walk down the road. The guy was Tommy. Tommy Briggs, 28 years old, had been a river and trail guide out of a small outfitter in Ridgecrest for the last 4 years. He'd grown up in the area, knew the terrain, knew the forest roads. When the outbreak hit, he'd grabbed his camping gear and his truck and his satellite communicator, which, he showed me, was a Garmin InReach, a device that could send and receive short text messages via satellite. And he'd gotten out of town 3 days in. He'd been sleeping in the truck on forest roads since then. He was mouthy, like immediately mouthy, the kind of person who doesn't have a filter and has made peace with that, and expects you to as well. He had strong opinions on everything, delivered them in rapid bursts, and had an outdoorsman's specific kind of arrogance about survival that I found slightly grating, and also, I will admit, somewhat reassuring. He knew how to do things I didn't. He knew the mountain better than I did. He had a hunting knife and a .22 rifle, which is not impressive firepower, but it is absolutely better than a wrench. I let him park the truck behind the equipment shed, where it wasn't visible from the road. I did not let him inside that first night. He slept in the truck. I left him a can of soup and a bottle of water, and told him we'd talk in the morning. That probably sounds cold. It was cold, but I needed to see how he behaved overnight before I introduced him to the inside of the building. I know that sounds paranoid. It's not paranoid. It's just the application of basic procedure to a situation where my margin for error was very small. In the morning, he was where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he'd said he was going to do, which was sleep. He was slightly irritated about the soup choice. You don't have anything other than lentil. But mostly, he was reasonable. We talked for 2 hours. I gave him the radio summary. He gave me the ground-level picture from the valley, which was worse than I'd thought. Ridgecrest had been partially evacuated on day 2. The sheriff had organized a convoy to move people south, toward what they believed was a more stable area. Maybe 400 people went. Maybe another 400 or 500 stayed, either because they couldn't leave or didn't want to or didn't trust the convoy. Tommy hadn't gone because he didn't trust the convoy, and because he had his truck and his gear, and figured he'd fare better on his own in the mountains than in a crowd moving south on a highway. He'd been right, as far as he could tell. He'd seen the convoy stopped on the highway from a ridge about a week later, stopped and not moving. That was all he'd seen, and he hadn't gone down to investigate. The ones that are still walking around down there, he said, nodding toward the valley. Are they? I mean, how many? I can't tell from the roads. From what I'm hearing on the radio, in a population that size, you're probably talking a few hundred. Ridgecrest wasn't a big enough population center to have the density problem the cities had. A few hundred. You can't get through a few hundred without a vehicle, an open road, and those roads are not open. Right. So we stay up here. How long do you think until... He stopped himself, reconsidered, started again. Do you think this is getting fixed? Like, is there still a functioning government somewhere that's handling this? I told him what I knew, which was what I was hearing on the radio. There was still functioning government somewhere. The FEMA channels weren't completely silent, and there were military units still operating. Whether it was being handled was a different question. Handled was a word that implied a trajectory toward resolution, and I didn't have evidence of a trajectory toward resolution. I had evidence of a situation that had been very bad and was now somewhat stabilized in certain areas and still deteriorating in others. So maybe, he said. Maybe, I said. He came inside that afternoon. I gave him the back room. I'd gotten the roof crack patched with roofing sealant I found in the shed, so it wasn't dripping anymore. And he gave me the rifle to hold overnight, which I hadn't asked for, and which I took as a good sign about his judgment. Here's something I should mention about the routine I'd established by the end of week 1, because the routine was what kept me from dissolving into the anxiety that was constantly at the edges of everything. I woke up roughly the same time every day. Not early, not late. 7 or so. First thing, before coffee, I went through the motion sensor check, reviewed the log from overnight. Then, I did a sweep of the accessible exterior, which meant walking the perimeter of the building and the area within the fence with the wrench. I was looking for anything out of place, any sign of approach, anything that needed my attention. This took 15 minutes. I did it every single morning without exception. Then coffee. Propane stove, real ground coffee that I'd bought in a large quantity. Specifically, because good coffee was the thing I'd refused to give up, even when I was cutting corners everywhere else. I had 5 pounds of it. I knew it was going to run out. I was not going to think about that now. While the coffee was going, I turned on the radio. Always the shortwave first, then the scanner, then the specific frequencies I wanted to monitor. I kept a log, not a sentimental diary, a log. Time, frequency, content summary, signal strength. Every significant transmission got a line. This was habit from my government days, and it was one of the most useful habits I had, because it meant that when patterns emerged, I could see them. When something changed, I could compare it to what it had been. Food, once a day, sometimes twice. I was running on about 1,200 calories, which is below what I'd normally eat, but not dangerously low. And I was also moving less than I normally would. Short outdoor excursions, no hiking, no reason to burn through reserves. I had enough food for a long time, but I still had the engineer's instinct to conserve and monitor, and not assume that what was there would be there indefinitely. Work. There was always something to work on. Improving the water system, fixing whatever I noticed was wrong with the building, continuing to sort and inventory the equipment, the antennas. I still had that third splice joint to repair, the one I'd ordered parts for. The parts had been shipped before the outbreak. They were not going to arrive, so I had to improvise. An improvised splice joint is not a perfect splice joint, but it's what you do when the alternative is a degraded antenna with 30% less efficiency. I spent 2 days on the antenna tower, going up in stages. The tower had a built-in climbing structure, step pegs set into the frame, and working on the cable. Good work. The kind of careful, precise work I was good at. The kind that required both hands and full attention, which meant my brain was occupied with something that had nothing to do with the sounds from the valley. After Tommy arrived, the routine incorporated him. He took a morning walk, a real one, up the slope behind the building, to the ridge, which gave him a vantage point over a different part of the valley. He came back with information. What he could see, what he couldn't, whether anything seemed to be moving toward the mountain. He was also quieter in the mornings than he was later in the day, which I appreciated. He started doing the perimeter check with me, which was better. 2 sets of eyes, and he knew the terrain in a way I was still learning. He spotted, on day 10 of the outbreak, a set of what looked like tracks in the soft ground near the north fence. Not footprints exactly. The ground was partly frozen, and the impressions were vague, but he was sure it was human, or near human. How near? I said. They came from the tree line and stopped at the fence, and then went back, or something that walked like a person did. We reinforced the north perimeter that day. More noise traps, pieces of wire strung between the fence and the building, with empty cans threaded on them, low to the ground. Not elegant, but if anything tripped it in the dark, we'd hear it. Day 11 of the outbreak. This is where the story changes, and I know that when I say changes, I mean it in both directions, better and worse at the same time. I was doing my morning radio sweep and I found something on 7.285 megahertz that made me stop and write down and then listen to again. It was a ham operator, out of what he said was a location about 60 miles east of me. His call sign was K0RLF. I wrote it in the log. He was looking for any operator in elevated terrain in the mountain region, specifically elevated terrain. He said he had a group of survivors who were trying to establish contact with any organized point of safety above 2,000 meters elevation. 2,000 meters? That's about 6,500 feet. I'm at 7,200 feet. I'm the demographic he's looking for. I sat there for a minute. Transmitting is a different thing from receiving. Receiving is invisible. Transmitting is announcing. But this person was already on the frequency, already looking. And if I had anything to offer, and I did, I had power and equipment and water and food, and a building that was currently pretty solid, then staying quiet was not obviously the right call. I keyed the transmitter, gave my call sign, W0CDR, my amateur license call sign, which I'd had since I was 22. K0RLF. This is W0CDR. I read you 5 by 5. I'm at approximately 7,200 feet. I have an operational station. I'm stable and provisioned. Who are you talking to? There was about 40 seconds of silence. He'd probably been transmitting blind without expecting a response. And then he came back. W0CDR. This is K0RLF. I'm reading you. Good signal. I have a group of 4. We're on foot. We were attempting to reach the highway, but the highway is not viable. We have 1 injured, not the infection. She fell. A broken ankle, we think. Can you receive visitors? 4 people. 1 injured. I told him to stand by. I covered the microphone and looked at Tommy, who'd been in the room listening. 4 more people, I said. Yep, Tommy said. One of them has a broken ankle. Yep, we have the food, the water, the space, I said. I was making myself go through it out loud, because that was how I made sure I wasn't making an emotional decision instead of a practical one. We have a vehicle if we need to move or make a run. Adding 4 people increases the daily resource consumption but also increases the capability. More people to watch, to work, to handle things. Unless one of them is a problem, Tommy said. Unless one of them is a problem. We looked at each other. He shrugged. I was a problem when you let me in, he said. You took the rifle overnight. You can screen. I keyed the transmitter. K0RLF. This is W0CDR. Give me your coordinates and I'll meet you. How far out are you? They were about 7 miles, on foot, on forest roads. It took 4 hours to coordinate a pickup. I drove the station truck, a beat-up Chevy I'd found in the equipment shed, left by the previous owner, that needed a battery and a fresh set of fluids, but ran once I'd given it those things, down the back route that Tommy knew, a Forest Service road that bypassed Ridgecrest entirely, and found them at a trail junction just where they said they'd be. 4 people. K0RLF was a man named Garrett. Not young, 60-something, with the kind of unhurried competence that comes from decades of doing things right. Retired electrical contractor, ham operator of 30 years, had been at his cabin about 20 miles out when the outbreak happened. He'd gathered 3 others who'd come to him as things deteriorated. The woman with the injured ankle was Faye Aldrich, 55, retired elementary school teacher from Ridgecrest. Garrett had found her on the road 2 days after the outbreak, trying to walk with a sprained ankle that she'd hurt on the first day. She'd kept going for 2 more days. The ankle had gotten worse, not better, and she was on a makeshift crutch that Garrett had put together from a tent pole. The other 2, Nolan Pruitt, 34, truck driver out of Grand Junction, who'd been between runs when it hit, had been sleeping in his cab at a rest stop, and had the good sense to stay in the cab for the first 12 hours, which probably saved him. And Bridget Hale, 22, who had been in the middle of a solo hiking trip with a backpack and a 10-day supply of food when she came down from the trail on day 2 and found the trailhead parking lot in a condition she described very simply as "I don't want to describe it," and then headed east on the forest roads on foot until she found Garrett. Bridget had a dog, a small, indeterminate breed dog named Hex, black and white, maybe 15 pounds, who she'd been carrying in her backpack because the dog's paws weren't good on the rocky terrain. The dog had not made a sound the entire time I was with them, just looked at everything with enormous brown eyes. I said to Bridget, "Your dog doesn't bark?" And she said, "Not really, no. Not unless she smells something that really concerns her." I filed that away. I loaded them into the truck, Faye in the front seat, everyone else in the back, Bridget with Hex on her lap, and drove the forest road back. Tommy met us at the equipment shed with the scanner in his hand, and a look on his face that was doing its best to be neutral and not quite managing it. We got Faye inside, and I had a look at her ankle, not broken, very badly sprained, possibly a minor ligament tear. I'd had enough first aid training to distinguish between a bone break and soft tissue, mostly. I splinted it, compression wrap and a rigid support made from a piece of aluminum channel I cut to length, and gave her ibuprofen and told her to stay off it. She thanked me in a way that suggested she'd already made peace with the situation and was just moving through it methodically. I liked her immediately. The others I showed around, explained the rules. No external noise at night, no lights visible through the window gaps after dark. Nothing goes on the generator without checking with me first. Water is from the filter only. Food comes from the central store, and we decide daily what gets eaten. Not because I was trying to be the boss, because I was the one who knew the system, and the system was working, and I needed it to keep working. Garrett understood immediately. Old engineer's mind, same as mine, got it without needing the explanation. He just nodded. Nolan was agreeable, didn't say much. He was quiet in a way that I initially read as reserved, but which I found myself watching over the following days, in a way I couldn't quite explain. He kept his left arm folded against his body a lot. Not dramatically, just there. The way you hold something that hurts. Tommy showed them the exterior setup. Bridget found a corner in the storage room for her sleeping bag, and Hex curled up next to her, and they were instantly composed. The two of them, like they'd decided they were fine and were sticking to it. 6 people, 1 station, 1 mountain, 1 set of resources. I went to the console and did my evening sweep and wrote everything in the log. Day 11 of the outbreak. End of entry. 6 adults, 1 dog. Station secure. Food and water adequate for extended occupation. Exterior barriers functional. Power stable. And then, below that, almost as an afterthought, I wrote, Nolan, watch the arm. Day 12. We started dividing up work. Garrett was the most useful immediate addition, skills-wise. He knew electrical work, not broadcast engineering specifically, but general electrical contracting, which meant he understood circuits and load balancing, and he could look at the wiring I'd done and tell me where it was good and where it was mediocre. He found 3 things I'd done that weren't wrong but weren't optimal, and corrected them in an afternoon. I didn't take it personally. Better done right. He also helped me with something I'd been planning but hadn't gotten to. The battery bank connection to the solar panels. The panels were still in boxes. Getting them installed and wired was a 2-person job, and with Garrett's skills it went faster than I'd expected. By the end of the 2nd day of the group being at the station, we had a small solar input. Not enough to run everything, but enough to keep the battery topped up during daylight without burning propane. That mattered. That mattered a lot. Tommy handled the exterior. He was good at it. He'd been a trail guide and he thought in terms of landscape and movement, which made him well suited to thinking about approach routes and defensive positioning. He went up to the ridge every morning and came back with a full report. And what he was seeing was, over the first week of all of us being together, consistently this: movement in the valley, figures, sometimes singular, sometimes in small groups of 2 or 3, moving slowly, not purposefully, going toward noise when there was noise, stopping when there wasn't. A few times, in the first week, we heard vehicles on the highway. Not many. Once what sounded like a military convoy, a distinct mechanical sound, heavy, diesel, multiple vehicles in sequence. Once a single vehicle moving very fast, which probably meant a survivor making a run and not wanting to stop. Once, on the 4th morning, the sound of a horn, persistent, like someone leaning on it. That lasted maybe 20 seconds and then stopped. Faye stayed inside and managed food. Her ankle was getting better, but she wasn't mobile enough for the exterior work, and she'd taken to the food system with a thoroughness that impressed me. She went through the entire stock, organized it, made a consumption ledger, calculated daily calorie needs per person, and presented me with a 3-page handwritten document that was more comprehensive than anything I'd done. She'd been a teacher. Organization was apparently second nature. She crossed things off the ledger every morning with the same casual authority with which she'd probably marked attendance. Bridget did a bit of everything. She was physically able and had the kind of outdoor background from her hiking that made the elevated terrain and the cold weather manageable for her. She also had a quality I noticed in the first day. She was observant. Not trained observant like I was. Naturally observant. She'd mentioned things offhand. That tree at the north fence moved differently yesterday. The winds changed direction. And usually those observations were correct, and sometimes they were relevant. Hex the dog stayed close to Bridget and remained almost entirely silent, which was uncanny. Small dogs are supposed to bark. This one didn't. She watched. She had a particular stillness that she'd maintain for long stretches and then abandon to investigate something very specifically. A smell, a shadow, and then return to stillness. I'd grown up with dogs. This dog was different from any dog I'd known. Not wrong, just particular. Nolan. Nolan hauled water. Nolan helped with the solar panel installation by passing things and holding things. Nolan ate his meals and said functional things and went to sleep in the equipment shed, which he'd claimed as his sleeping space because it was slightly warmer than the back room. He took the first watch shift at night without being asked, which was good. But I kept watching the arm. It was the left forearm. He kept it covered, always long sleeves, which was practical in the mountain cold. But I noticed he never rolled them up even when he was working near heat sources. The one time he did push the sleeve up part way, I saw a bandage on the inner forearm. White, clean on the surface but with some discoloration at the edges, a brownish-yellow stain through the cloth. Old wound, still being dressed. He saw me look. He said, "Wire, from the fence at the rest stop, when I was getting out of the cab." "When was that?" I said. "First day, day 1. And it's still bandaged." "It's fine," he said, "just slow to heal." I nodded. I didn't push it, because maybe it was fine. Wire cuts heal slowly, especially if you're stressed and not eating well, and sleeping in bad conditions. And he'd shown no other signs. No fever I could see, no change in behavior, no aggression, no confusion. He was calm and functional and helping, and had been for the 4 days since they'd arrived. But day 1, a wound from day 1, that was still discolored on day 16 of the outbreak. I wrote it in the log. Nolan's arm. Day 1 origin. Still presenting. I'd revisit it. Later. Let me tell you about the basement, because I've been putting it off and I shouldn't. The station has a basement. It's accessible through a hatch in the floor of the storage room. A steel hatch, hinged, with a lift ring, about 4 feet by 3 feet, with a short ladder going down about 8 feet into a space that was maybe 12 feet square. Concrete floor, concrete walls, some shelving along 2 walls that had old equipment on it, circuit boards, spare parts, cable reels, and an HVAC duct running along the ceiling that connected to the building's climate control. I'd been down there once in my first week to check what was there. I'd inventoried the shelves, found nothing useful beyond a few spare parts for equipment I didn't have, and come back up and latched the hatch. I'd made a mental note to clean it out at some point. I hadn't gone back. Day 13 of the outbreak, 2 days after the group arrived, Garrett came to me while I was at the console and said, very calmly, "There's a man in your basement." I looked up. "I'm sorry?" "Come look." He walked me to the storage room. The hatch was still latched. He pointed at it and said, "Listen." I listened. From below, very faint, I could hear breathing, regular breathing, not labored, just slow and quiet and present. And then, as I stood there, a very slight movement. The click of something being shifted. Something plastic, maybe. Old circuit board on a shelf. There was someone in my basement. Had been there for, I had no idea how long. Since before I arrived? That was almost 3 weeks ago. Was that possible? I unlocked the hatch and lifted it slowly, standing to one side. I had the wrench. Tommy was beside me in about 30 seconds once I waved him over. The space below was dark. I had a flashlight and I shone it in. There was a man on the floor, sitting against the far wall. Old, very old, I thought initially, though I later revised that down to around 75. He was wrapped in a space emergency blanket, the crinkly foil kind. He had a water bottle. He had several flat cardboard boxes as insulation between himself and the concrete floor. He was wearing a mechanic's coverall over what looked like several layers of clothing. He was not infected. I could tell that immediately. He looked up at me with focused, present eyes and said, in a voice roughened from probably days of not using it, "Mr. Deering, you've been running a lot of propane." He knew my name. "Who are you?" I said. "Lester Price," he said. "I used to own this station. I'll be honest. There's a specific feeling that comes with learning that an old man has been living in your basement for the better part of 3 weeks and knew who you were. It's not fear exactly. It's closer to the feeling you get when you're working on a system and you find evidence of a modification you didn't make. Someone has been in here, someone with access and knowledge, and you are going to have to figure out what they did and why. We got him out of the basement. He couldn't climb the ladder easily on his own, not because he was physically destroyed actually, but because his joints were stiff and he moved carefully. Once up, he stood straight and didn't have the look of someone who'd been living in a hole. He was thin. His eyes were clear. Faye brought him food, and he ate it with unhurried efficiency, not the desperate eating of someone genuinely starved. He'd had provisions. He'd been managing. I sat across from him and asked the obvious questions. He answered them in the order they were asked, which I appreciated. He'd been at the station when the outbreak happened. He'd come back to the property. He didn't say why, and I didn't push it yet. The day before the outbreak began, which was day 13, the same day I'd done the drive toward town and seen the highway. He'd seen my truck and seen the lights and realized the station had a new owner, and he'd known I was there. He hadn't announced himself because he wasn't sure how I'd react to the previous owner showing up at the property he'd just sold. When the outbreak hit and things became obviously very bad, he'd made the decision to stay out of sight. He had a key to the basement, had kept one, and he'd supplied it quietly over the first day while I was focused on other things. He'd been there since. "Why didn't you just knock on the door?" Tommy said, which was a fair question with what I thought was an obvious answer. "I wasn't sure how much of a problem I'd be," Lester said. "Old man, no skills, you don't have better. I thought I'd see how things played out. 3 weeks is a long time to stay hidden. I'm patient." I believed the practical part of the story. It tracked with how someone methodical and private would think about the situation. But there were other parts I didn't believe, or at least didn't believe were complete. He kept trying, in the days after I let him into the main building, to access certain equipment. Specifically, the secondary monitoring panel, which covered some of the frequency ranges that the main console didn't. He'd ask about it. He'd walk by it and slow down. Once I came into the monitoring room and found him standing at the panel, not touching it, just looking at it. And when I asked what he was doing, he said, "Reading the settings. You've got some unusual things configured." "I know what I've configured," I said. "The 584.7 frequency," he said. "You have it flagged. I noticed anomalous traffic there before the outbreak." He looked at me and then away. "That's a managed band," he said. "Some of what comes through there isn't interference." I waited for more. That was all he said. He moved on. I put it in the log. Lester Price, former owner, claims 5847 megahertz, managed. Did not elaborate. He said things like that, precise and partial, like a person who had information and was rationing how much of it they shared without entirely knowing why. He wasn't hostile. He was helpful in certain specific ways. He knew things about the building I didn't, maintenance history, quirks of the antenna system, why certain pieces of equipment were configured the way they were. He told me about a water backup I hadn't known about, a buried secondary cistern on the east side of the property. That was useful. That was genuinely useful. But he'd go quiet at the wrong moments. He'd be answering a question and then just stop, and the pause would stretch, and then he'd say something unrelated. Once, very late at night when I thought everyone was asleep and I was at the console, I heard him come into the monitoring room and stand behind me for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, "You should watch what you transmit. They can triangulate from the signal." "Who can?" I said. He went back to his sleeping area. That was the full conversation. I sat there for a while after that. Then I went back to the console. I turned off the transmitter and ran on receive only for the next 24 hours while I thought about what he'd said. Week 2. Let me tell you about the food runs, because it's not as dramatic as it sounds, and also much more unpleasant than it sounds at the same time. By day 15 of the outbreak, we'd been consuming from the central food store for 4 days with 6 people, and I needed to revise my estimate of how long we had. Faye's ledger was useful here. She'd been tracking daily. At current consumption rates, we had roughly 4 months for 6 people. That sounds like a lot, until you start thinking about what 4 months actually means. It means we needed a plan for after 4 months, and we didn't have one. I also needed fuel. I was burning propane on the generator and the cooking stove, and while the solar was helping with the generator load, the propane for cooking was just consumption. I had 200 pounds of propane and a stove that burned about a pound per hour at low heat. Math. Not enough. And there was a specific item I needed badly. Medications. My blood pressure medication was down to 3 pills. I'd been managing okay without it. The lower stress of having a routine and physical work was better for blood pressure than the high-stress desk job I'd had for years. But I wasn't going to pretend indefinitely that it wasn't a consideration. Tommy knew the area. He proposed a route, down the back forest road, around the south edge of Ridgecrest, to a small hardware and feed store about 4 miles east of town that he'd done deliveries for before. The store would have propane canisters. It might have canned food. It might have tools. The town pharmacy was a harder problem. It was in the center of Ridgecrest, which meant passing through the densest part of where the infected would be concentrated. We didn't know their current numbers or distribution. We'd been watching from the ridge, but the mountain perspective doesn't give you street-level density information. We decided to do the hardware store first. 2 people, Tommy and I. Garrett wanted to come, but I needed him at the station with the radio in case something happened. Nolan offered. I told him he could come on a future run and watched his face for anything and got nothing I could read clearly. The run to the hardware store was, in the daylight, more informative about the state of the world than 2 weeks of radio had been. The forest road was empty. We moved slowly and quietly. I'd brought the truck, but Tommy cut the engine on the downhill sections and coasted where we could, because engine noise carries, and I wasn't going to be careless with noise. The road down to the south edge of town was clear. No vehicles stopped on it, no figures. At the edge of town, we stopped. I looked through the binoculars. The main street of Ridgecrest, visible at an angle from where we'd stopped, had figures on it. 7 that I could count. Maybe more I couldn't see. Moving in that way I'd heard described by ham operators, but hadn't yet seen in person. Slow, not purposeless exactly, but not directed either. Like they were walking because they'd always walked, and hadn't been told to stop. I watched for 5 minutes. They were not looking our way. The engine was off. The road we were on was not in their sight line from the main street. As long as we didn't make significant noise, we were not going to draw attention. We went around them. Tommy knew which streets to take. He'd grown up here. He knew which blocks went where. He knew that the route to the hardware store went behind the old feed co-op and didn't touch Main Street. We drove that route with the windows down, listening, very slowly. I can tell you what it smells like in a town 4 days into an outbreak, at least a small town with 2,000 people in October weather. It smells wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not the way you'd expect from the movies. Just wrong. Like something that should be happening isn't. An absence of smell, almost. No diesel from trucks. No food smells from the diner. No trash collection smell from a garbage truck. The absence of all the background smells of a functioning place, replaced by cold air and pine, and something faintly sour underneath. The hardware store was locked. The front door, plate glass, had been broken at some point. There was glass on the pavement outside, but it had been there long enough to be stepped through, scattered wide. Something had gone in or out of that door days ago. We went in through it, stepping carefully. Inside was dark. I had my flashlight, Tommy had his. We worked quickly. Propane canisters. A good find. 12 of the 1-pound camping canisters, and 3 larger exchange tanks. Extension cords. Wire and connectors. A box of heavy-duty zip ties. Batteries, a lot of them, which I hadn't thought to look for but was very glad to find. A first aid kit still in the packaging. Work gloves, 3 pairs. A propane camp stove that was newer and more efficient than what I had, still in the box. An axe that was there for splitting kindling, but served other purposes in the current context. I took it all. I also took every can of food I found on a shelf near the register. It was trail food, camping supply, but actual calories in sealed packaging. Peanut butter crackers, trail mix, jerky, freeze-dried meals that needed boiling water. I found medication. Not prescription medication, but over-the-counter. Aspirin, ibuprofen, cold medicine, antihistamines, antiseptic, antidiarrheal. I cleared the shelf, all of it into the truck. The pharmacy was the harder question. Tommy and I talked about it, standing in the hardware store parking lot at the truck, while I loaded the last of the supplies. If we go around the back of the grocery and down the service alley, we can get to the pharmacy loading dock without coming out on Main Street, he said. The loading dock has a steel door, but I know where the spare key is. I used to deliver supplies here. How many did you count on Main Street? 7 we could see. Could be more inside buildings. They don't go into buildings unless sound draws them in. Far as we know. He was right that it was a far as we know situation. Everything about how these things behaved was built on incomplete information, assembled from ham radio reports and second-hand accounts. I'd seen them at my gate in the dark, and heard what sounded like them on the highway, but I hadn't actually observed them at close range doing anything. In and out, I said. No noise. We don't run unless we have to, because running makes noise. We move like we're not there. You have any experience sneaking around? Tommy said. I have a lot of experience moving slowly in tight spaces while doing delicate work, I said. It's not the same thing, but the patience requirement is similar. We did it. The loading dock key was where Tommy said it was, in a magnetic hide-a-key box under the dock step, because that's the kind of thing small-town businesses do, and it makes you feel tender and sad about the world, in a way that doesn't help. The door opened. We were inside. The pharmacy was a small one. A town this size, you get a small pharmacy attached to the back of the general supply section of the grocery store. Drug storage was in the back room. I went to it while Tommy watched the front. Here's the thing about prescription medications in an unoccupied pharmacy. They're locked up, obviously. Cabinet with a deadbolt. Not something I was going to pick or break quickly without tools. I hadn't brought tools for this specific thing. What I had was knowledge. I knew, from my years of government building access, that key safes and lockboxes in small commercial operations are very often secured in a cursory way, because nobody expects the threat model I was currently bringing. The cabinet had a standard deadbolt with a strike plate mounted with half-inch screws in hollow door material. I found a pry bar in a cleaning supply closet, put it in the gap, and applied my weight. The door opened in one pull. Not elegant. Effective. I found my blood pressure medication. A different brand than I had, but the same class of drug. Close enough. I took enough for 6 months, and stopped counting, and walked away from the rest, because I didn't have a list, and guessing what else someone in our group might need was a hole I didn't want to go down. I also took antibiotics. Broad spectrum, 2 full bottles, and a good supply of wound care materials, suture kits still in packaging, which I'd had training to use, surgical skin staples, professional-grade antiseptic. We were out and back in the truck in 14 minutes. On the way back, coasting with the engine off on the downhill section, Tommy said, "That was fine." "That was fine," I agreed. "We should do it again. When we need to. When we need to. Not before." Back at the station, Faye logged everything I'd brought in with the same calm thoroughness she used for everything. Garrett sorted the electrical supplies. Lester looked at what we'd gotten and said nothing, which from him was practically a compliment. Nolan helped carry things inside. His left arm, I noticed, went up to take something heavy, and he stopped and shifted to his right. The motion was smooth, practiced, the way you move around a pane without advertising it. He looked at me and away. I said nothing. Something happened that I still think about. It was night 17 of the outbreak. Everyone was asleep except me. I'd taken the late shift at the console, which I usually did because I sleep lightly anyway, and the nighttime frequencies were often more active than daytime. Less interference. Certain bands open up due to atmospheric changes at night, and the people who were transmitting in the dark were usually the people with the most specific things to say. I was scanning the ham net on 40 meters, 7 megahertz range, and the net was quiet. Late night check-in cycle done, when I picked up something on a frequency just above the net. Not ham traffic, something on 7.318 megahertz, which is not a standard ham frequency. Not any standard frequency I knew offhand. It was breathing. That's the only word for it. A steady, low-frequency carrier wave with a pattern of amplitude variation that genuinely sounded, like breathing. In and out, about 14 breaths per minute, which is a normal resting respiration rate for an adult. I stared at the display for a while. I tuned carefully around it. It wasn't a subcarrier artifact from a nearby broadcast. The nearest frequency with significant power was far enough away. It wasn't audio leaking from a narrowband communications signal. It was, as far as I could tell, its own transmission. Someone transmitting breathing. I ran the bearing. Northeast. Same general direction as the anomaly I'd logged before the outbreak. I noted the time, the frequency, the signal strength. 3/9 again, weak, and kept watching. It lasted 11 minutes by the clock, and then stopped cleanly. Not faded out, not distorted, just stopped. like someone keying off a transmitter. I thought about what Lester had said, that 58047 is managed, that not everything on certain frequencies is interference. I went to where Lester was sleeping, the storage room floor, on a camping pad, which was better than the concrete of the basement, and I woke him up, gently. He opened his eyes without startling, which told me he was a light sleeper who'd been expecting to be woken. "The breathing on 7.318, I said. "What is that?" He looked at me. His face in the flashlight beam was old and lined and not at all afraid. "I don't know what's on 7.318, he said. "But you know about 5847. Silence. Then, "I ran the station for 22 years. You hear things, on certain frequencies. I learned to leave them alone." "What kind of things?" "Patterns," he said. "Repetitive patterns that weren't consistent with known traffic. Sometimes voice, sometimes just carrier. At certain times of day, certain weather conditions affect it." He paused. "I reported it once, to the FCC. You know what the FCC said?" "Nothing," I said, "because I used to work for the FCC, and I knew what the FCC said when you reported unexplained frequency usage." "Nothing," he confirmed. I went back to the console. I sat there for a long time. I did not transmit. I thought about the military frequency I'd been monitoring, about the phrase, Northern Quadrant Tower Assets. I thought about the pattern on 5847 that had started before the outbreak. I thought about what an emergency communications engineer who'd spent 22 years at a remote elevated station might have observed about the frequency spectrum that the organization supposedly overseeing the spectrum hadn't wanted to talk about. I don't have a clean explanation for this. I'm not the kind of person who usually ends up in the corner of the room constructing conspiracy theories from radio anomalies. I believe in signals having sources, sources having explanations, and explanations being findable if you look carefully enough. That's how my mind works. But the breathing was real. The pattern on 5847 was real. The military reference to tower assets was real. And Lester, who was specific about everything and vague about this particular thing, was real. I kept listening. Nolan's arm. Day 19. I'd been watching and waiting and not saying anything, and on the morning of day 19, I came into the equipment shed before he was awake, and I sat down and waited for him to wake up, because I needed to have this conversation, and I needed to have it without an audience. He opened his eyes and saw me, and I could see him register immediately that this wasn't an accidental early morning encounter. "The arm," I said. "How bad is it?" He looked at the ceiling for a while. Then he pulled up his left sleeve. It was not good. The wound itself was a scrape, or had been a scrape. A long, shallow abrasion along the inner forearm. Wire fence, plausibly. But it was 3 weeks old, and it looked like it was a week old. Red at the edges, the skin around it discolored, and warm-looking even from a foot away. Not healing. Something about the tissue was wrong, the way healing skin is supposed to knit together in a predictable pattern, and this wasn't doing that. "Did something bite you?" I said. "No," he said immediately. I looked at him. "I don't know," he said. "I was in the cab. Something was at the cab door hitting it. I opened the window to see what it was, and I pulled back and the arm caught the window frame. Wire mesh on the window frame. That's what it was." "Something was at the door," I said. "At the cab door. On day 1. "Yeah." "Did it break the window?" "No. The window was down. Partway. I was trying to see what was happening, and I pulled back, and the frame, the metal frame of the window, it has that wire mesh screen on some older cab designs." "Did anything touch your arm, other than the window frame?" Very long pause. He was looking at the arm. "I don't know. I don't think so. I was moving fast. It was dark." I sat there with that for a minute. Then I said, "Why didn't you tell us?" He looked at me directly for the first time. "Because I don't know. I genuinely don't know what happened. And I've been watching myself for 3 weeks, and I feel fine. I'm not running a fever. I don't feel confused. I can have this conversation. I know who you are, and where I am, and what day it is." "Okay," I said. "Okay? That's it? I'm not going to throw you out, I said. I don't know enough to make a call on this, and you know it. Nobody knows enough. The information about what actually causes infection, and at what rate, and from what exposures, is not reliable from what I've heard. And I'm not going to exile someone from a mountain in October on incomplete information. He let out a breath. But I need you to tell me if anything changes, I said. Fever, confusion, anything. You don't hide it. I won't. And I need to see the arm every day. He nodded. I went back to the main building. I made my coffee. I sat at the console. I did not write what I'd just learned in the main log because the main log was accessible to everyone, including Nolan, and I wasn't ready to create a group situation until I had more information. I wrote it in a separate notebook I kept in my jacket pocket. That notebook was one of those small wire-bound ones, the kind reporters use, and it had become a parallel record to the official log. Things I wasn't ready to name publicly. Lester's 5847 comment. The breathing on 7.318. The military tower assets reference. Nolan's arm. Origin unclear. 4 items in a notebook that probably didn't connect and might all have individual explanations. I kept the notebook. Week 3. This is where things started to move faster, and I stopped having the luxury of slow observation. Day 21. Tommy came down from the ridge moving fast, which was unusual enough that I had the door open before he reached it. Vehicle convoy, he said. On the highway, moving north. I went to the roof access. There was a hatch on the equipment shed roof that gave a wide view down the mountain, and looked. He was right. 4 vehicles in a loose convoy, moving north on the highway. Not military looking, or not traditionally military. They were civilian trucks, large ones, but with what looked like modifications, welded steel panels on the sides, and what might have been gun ports, or just holes that looked like gun ports from this distance. They were moving with purpose, not lost, not slow. A group that had somewhere to go, and was going there. We watched them pass. They didn't stop at Ridgecrest. They didn't slow down. I went to the radio immediately. I tuned through the vehicle frequencies. CB radio is 27 megahertz, and convoy groups often use CB because it doesn't require a license, and I found them. Channel 19, which is the standard trucking channel, and they were talking. 4 Pines is confirmed cold, one voice said. I didn't know what 4 Pines was. What about the tower on the ridge? Another voice said. I put the pencil down. I picked it up again. Unknown. Map shows a broadcast facility. No contact. Worth a stop? We don't stop unless we have to. Keep moving. They moved on. Their signal faded as they went around the bend in the highway going north, and then they were gone. I sat there. Garrett had come in behind me and was listening. He said, they knew the station was here. The station is on maps, I said. Any detailed regional map shows broadcast infrastructure. They knew it was a broadcast station, and they didn't stop. They were moving north. They had a destination. 4 Pines, Garrett said. I didn't know what 4 Pines was. I had no map reference. I made a note to ask Lester, who knew this area better than anyone. Lester knew it. 4 Pines was a campground, federal land, about 35 miles north in the higher mountains. He'd been there, large, with a permanent ranger station that had a backup generator and a well. Good ground for a group to shelter. He thought maybe 50 or 60 people at capacity. And now it's cold, I said. He didn't answer. Day 22 brought the first real close call at the station since the early days. I was doing the morning exterior check and I found the north fence breached. Not cut, not damaged. Bent inward at a spot near the east corner where the posts had shifted in the ground. The soil up here freezes and thaws fast in October, and the post footings move. I'd checked this fence, but I hadn't checked this section, and the post had heeled over about 15 degrees, and the chain link at the bottom had pulled away from the rail and left a gap. How big a gap? I crouched and looked. Maybe 18 inches at the widest. Was it enough? I had no idea. From everything I knew about how infected people moved, they didn't actively problem solve. They moved toward stimulus, and they kept moving in that direction until they encountered an obstacle or the stimulus stopped. An 18-inch gap at ground level, partially hidden by a healed-over section of fence, was not an obvious opening unless something was specifically trying to find one. But something had, because there were scuff marks in the soil on the inside of the fence, where the ground was softer in a low spot. Multiple scuff marks. Something had come through the gap overnight. I went around the building looking for what had come through. I found it, or them, on the north face of the building, at the base of the wall, where there was a shallow recess between the building and the equipment shed. 3 figures, standing against the wall. Not moving, standing, in that way that I now recognized as how they waited when the sound that had drawn them had stopped. They'd come through the fence, walked toward the building, and stopped at the wall because there was nothing to tell them to do otherwise. They were close. 8 feet from where I was standing, I had the axe. Here's the thing about standing 8 feet from someone infected that I did not know from radio reports, and did not know from any account I'd read. You know in an instant that there is a difference between an infected person and a corpse, and the difference is not comfortable. They breathe. Unevenly, but they breathe. They have muscle tone, not the limpness of death. They hold themselves in postures that are almost natural, almost the posture of a person who is just tired and leaning against a wall in the cold. The horror isn't that they're wrong. The horror is that they're almost right. I did not engage them. I went back around the building quietly and got Garrett and Tommy without making noise. We discussed it in low voices in the main building. The 3 of them had been there for an unknown amount of time, were not moving, had not triggered the alarms because the alarms were at the south fence, not the north. They would stay until something gave them a reason to move. We needed them to move away from the building, and we needed them to move in a direction that wasn't toward us. Garrett took a canned food item, a can of beans, and went out the south face, around the long way, to the north side of the property fence, and threw the can down the slope. It hit gravel, and clattered and rolled. All 3 of them turned toward the sound and walked toward it, slowly, steady, walking toward where the sound had been. They went through the fence gap because that was the way toward the sound. They went down the slope. We fixed the fence post. We fixed the gap. We added additional noise trap wires on the inside of the north face. I sat with the axe for a while that afternoon and thought about how close that had been. Not close in the sense of dramatic danger. They hadn't known we were there. They hadn't charged anything. But 8 feet is 8 feet, and if one of them had happened to bump the wall, or if I'd come around the corner 5 seconds later and they'd been facing me instead of the wall, the reaction time involved would have been very small. Close calls don't feel close when they're happening. They feel close after, when you're sitting still, and your body runs the alternative version. Day 24. This is the one I keep coming back to. It was 3 in the morning, and I was at the console, and I found something. I hadn't been looking for it specifically. I was doing a slow scan through the upper HF range, 14 to 21 megahertz, which at night can bounce signals an enormous distance, when I landed on a frequency that had clear, plain language military traffic. Not the partially encrypted traffic I'd been hearing. Plain language. 2 operators, clearly. And from the first sentence I caught, I knew this was different. Confirm the asset is still operational. Over. Asset operational. Positive. Signal output normal. Over. And the location is secure? Civilian occupation? A pause. Unconfirmed on the civilian side. We have signal presence but no visual. The asset is on automatic. It doesn't need operators. It just needs to be running. Over. Understood. What's the timeline on the next? And then it went encrypted. Just like that. Clean transition. Probably triggered by a protocol, or by someone noticing they'd slipped to plain language mode. I sat very still. Asset. Signal output. Running. Northern quadrant. I turned back to my notebook and underlined the words I'd written before. Northern quadrant tower assets. I was a tower. I was at elevation. I was broadcasting, or had been broadcasting when I was transmitting. And there was military traffic discussing an asset in my area that needed to be running, that was on automatic, that didn't require operators. My station was not on automatic. My station was manual. I was the operator. Unless I went to the equipment room. I went through the back panel of the secondary monitoring array, which is where the pre-existing station electronics were. the ones that predated my ownership. I'd checked them when I arrived, but not comprehensively. There was a lot of equipment, and some of it was unfamiliar models I hadn't worked with. In the back panel, behind a circuit board I'd noted as inactive when I first inventoried, I found a secondary transmitter module, small, solid state, designed to be unobtrusive, and it was active. The green indicator light was on, and the output power meter, a small analog one, was showing a reading. It was transmitting something. On a frequency I checked and found 580.47 kilohertz. The frequency I'd been logging as an anomaly since day 11. The previous owner's station, the managed frequency, the thing Lester knew about and hadn't told me. I put a piece of tape over the indicator light and went to find Lester. He was awake. He was sitting in the storage room on his sleeping pad, and he looked at me with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific door to open. "Talk to me," I said. He did. Lester had run the station for 22 years. Before that, he'd had a government contract. Not FCC, not a civilian agency. He was careful about what he called it. He said, a contract for the installation of monitoring equipment at elevated communications facilities. He said it was the 1990s. He said the equipment was supposed to be passive, just receiving environmental data, atmospheric monitoring. He said he'd signed a non-disclosure agreement that he'd never technically been released from. The module in the back panel was part of that installation. It had been put in by the contractors in 1997. He'd maintained it as part of the original deal, kept the power running to it, kept the antenna connection intact, and in exchange, he'd had certain benefits. Regulatory cooperation on his broadcast license, favorable interference rulings when neighboring stations had caused problems, small things that added up. He didn't know exactly what the module was transmitting. He'd been told it was environmental data. Atmospheric monitoring was his understanding. He'd believed it because it matched what little he could observe. The transmissions were on a non-standard frequency. They were low power. They were automated and periodic. Nothing about them looked like surveillance or active intelligence gathering. It looked like sensor output. "What made you come back?" I said. "Why were you here the day before the outbreak?" He looked at his hands. The module had been sending a new pattern for about 3 weeks, different from its normal output. I noticed it on my receiver at home. I still had equipment tuned to that frequency. The new pattern was, I don't know how to describe it, more urgent, higher transmission rate. I came back to look at the hardware. 3 weeks before the outbreak, I said, the same time I first noticed the anomaly on 5847. You noticed it because I'd changed something in the configuration, trying to read the new output. I adjusted the antenna coupling, and it would have changed the signal characteristics enough to make it detectable. I sat on the floor of the storage room because there were no chairs, and I needed to sit. The module started transmitting a new pattern 3 weeks before the outbreak, I said. You came to investigate. You hid in the basement. The outbreak happened. And now there's military traffic asking about tower assets and whether they're still operational. Yes, he said. What do you think it means? He was quiet for a long time. Then, I think the network, whatever the network was installed for, has relevance to what's happening. I think that's why they want to know it's still running. I don't think it has anything to do with causing what's happening. I think it's a monitoring network for something that they already knew was possible. A detection network. They knew this was possible. Someone did, at some level. I went back to the console and I didn't sleep. The thing about working in emergency communications for 11 years is that you're not naive about the distance between what the official structure says it does and what it actually does. You see the back channels. You see the layers. You understand that emergency preparedness is a phrase that encompasses a lot of preparation for scenarios that the people doing the preparing aren't willing to publicly acknowledge. You don't necessarily conclude conspiracy from that. You conclude that people in certain positions know things that other people don't know, and that some of those things are things they'd rather not be on the record as knowing. I'd spent my career inside that structure, and I'd never seen anything that made me feel like I was inside something actively wrong. Bureaucratic, yes. Opaque, certainly. Inefficient in specific documented ways. but not wrong in the sense of directed malice. The module in my equipment rack changed the shape of that picture in a way I hadn't finished processing. I was still processing it when, 9 hours later, Faye came into the console room and said, "There's someone on the radio calling for you specifically." The frequency was 146.520, the standard calling frequency I'd been monitoring. The voice was a woman's, and she was asking for W0CDR by call sign, which meant she had a list of active stations or had heard me transmit at some point. I keyed in, "W0CDR here. Go ahead. W0CDR. This is KD0RTL. I'm calling from a group shelter at approximately 41 degrees north latitude. We've been monitoring you for 4 days. We know your position. We wanted to make sure you're still operational." Her voice was professional, controlled, the kind of voice that meant she'd been broadcasting regularly and had stopped having to think about what her voice was doing while she did it. "KD0RTL. I'm operational," I said. "Who are you with?" "A mixed group, 43 individuals, at a location I won't give on open frequency. We have a medic. We have food for about 8 weeks. We're stable. We've been using your transmissions to triangulate survivor positions in the region." "My transmissions," I said. "I haven't been transmitting much. Mostly receive." "You've been transmitting more than you think," she said. "The module in your secondary panel. We can see its output." I put the pencil down again. "Go to 14.225, she said. "Encrypted channel. I'll explain more there." She gave a key sequence. I looked at Garrett. He was at the door. He'd heard. I switched to the frequency. I had equipment that could handle the encryption format she'd specified. I had it because it was surplus government gear, and I'd bought it at the same sale as the HF receiver, knowing the keys for it from my government days. Not something I was supposed to still have access to, technically, but also not something I'd been asked to give back. The encrypted channel came up clear. Her voice, different now, that she wasn't on open airwaves. "The module in your secondary panel is part of a network of distributed monitoring stations placed at elevated broadcast facilities in a 12-state region in the mid-90s. The network was built as an early warning system for biological event detection, specifically for detecting the conditions that precede certain types of mass pathogen events. It monitors atmospheric particulates, water vapor chemistry, and some electromagnetic indicators that correlate with pre-outbreak conditions." "It's a detection network," I said, "for outbreaks like this one." "Like this specific one," she said. "This isn't the first time it's been this active. The network had significant output in 2003 and 2012, but both of those events were contained at the initial outbreak clusters. This one wasn't. Why not? Different pathogen, different transmission rate, different incubation. The containment protocols were designed for the 2003 version. They didn't scale. You knew this was coming." She paused. "The network knew. The people monitoring the network knew. What happened with that information above a certain level, I can't tell you. What I can tell you is that the people who built it and maintained it expected it to be a detection system, not a response system. They prepared for the alarm. They didn't fully prepare for the fire." I thought about Lester in his basement, the man who'd maintained an atmospheric sensor for 22 years, thinking it was environmental monitoring. And it was environmental monitoring, just not the kind that involved weather. "Why are you telling me this?" I said. "Because," she said, "we're trying to build a real communication network, not what's left of the government trying to communicate down to survivors. Survivors communicating laterally with each other. Your station, your elevation, your equipment. You're one of the best positioned broadcast assets in this region. We'd like you to be a relay point." "For what?" "Evacuation information, routes, safe locations, survivor contacts. We're building a map, a real-time map of what's actually viable out there, based on people who are actually out there, not based on government planning that was written for a scenario that doesn't match what we're seeing." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Tell me about the evacuation zone." That's where things turned complicated in a way that I need to describe carefully, because in retrospect, there are at least 3 different ways to read what happened, and I'm not sure I have the right one. The transmission about an evacuation collection point, the one that Bridget actually found first, scrolling through frequencies on the handheld scanner while I was on the encrypted channel, was on a FEMA frequency, automated, running on a 4-hour repeat cycle. It gave a location, a specific coordinate point about 200 miles south, accessible via 2 specified highway routes. A date, 12 days from when we first heard it. A confirmation code, a series of numbers that was meant to verify the transmission as official. When I talked to the woman on the encrypted channel, she told me her name eventually, just her first name, Donna, former State Emergency Management Coordinator. She confirmed the evacuation point was real. She'd been in contact with the group running it. It was a federal facility, she said, solid, provisioned, with medical capability and security. 200 miles south, I said, on specified highway routes. Yes, the same highway routes that, from everything I can see and hear, are blocked with abandoned vehicles and moving with infected in significant numbers. Parts of them, she said. The group coordinating the collection point has been running convoy clearing operations. The routes are being cleared progressively. By the time the collection date hits, the primary route should be passable. Should be. Should be, she agreed. There are no certainties, but the alternative is staying in place indefinitely, and the math on staying in place indefinitely. She stopped. You know the math on staying in place indefinitely? I did. I knew it very well. I'd been running it since Faye gave me her food ledger. 4 months of food was 4 months, not forever. The propane had a timeline. The generator had maintenance cycles and would eventually need parts I didn't have. The building was solid, but it had vulnerabilities I couldn't fully address with what I had. Indefinite stay was a pleasant phrase for a finite situation. 200 miles, I said again, almost to myself. The route through the national forest bypasses the worst sections, she said. Smaller roads, slower, but the clearance problem is different on secondary roads. The infected disperse differently without the high-density urban bottlenecks. I told her I'd think about it and get back to her. I went to find everyone. I'm going to describe the group conversation about the evacuation option the way it actually went, which is to say messily, and with a lot of talking past each other before anyone said the thing they actually meant. We were in the main room, all 6 of us, which was crowded. The room is not big, and we'd added a folding table that took up most of the middle. Lester had been told about the encrypted channel conversation in the broad strokes, and was listening with the careful stillness he brought to everything now. Bridget had Hex in her lap. Tommy was standing, which is what he did when he was going to talk a lot. I laid it out. The evacuation point, the coordinates, the date, what Donna had told me about the route status, the math on our supplies. Tommy went first, which was predictable. 200 miles is not a small thing. I've seen what's on that highway, or part of it, and that's just the section near here. 200 miles on roads we don't know the current condition of, with 1 truck and 6 people and whatever we can fit in it. And a dog, Bridget said. And a dog, yes, against staying here, where we have power, water, food, a working communication system, and walls. For how long? Garrett said. Long enough to figure out a better option. The evacuation point is a better option, Garrett said. I've been running through the logic on this. We have the resources to stay until approximately late February or early March at current consumption. After that, we're in an unmanaged decline. Medical needs will emerge that we can't meet here. The station building is not a long-term habitation. It wasn't built for 6 people and wasn't designed for year-round occupation at this elevation in terms of insulation and heating capacity. The best case for staying is buying time. The evacuation is a different trajectory entirely. If it's real, Tommy said. The woman who told me about it had specific knowledge that I couldn't have broadcast, and she couldn't have known unless she was what she said she was, I said. The confirmation code for the broadcast checks out against the FEMA authentication format I used to work with. That's not definitive, but it's something. We don't know what we're driving into, Tommy said, and we know what we have here. Faye had been quiet. She said, we know what we have here decreasing. We don't know what we're driving into, which means there's uncertainty in both directions. It could be better than we're imagining. It could be worse. I prefer uncertain better to certain worse, Bridget said. We all looked at her. She shrugged. I mean, that's just the math, right? Nolan hadn't said anything. He was sitting at the edge of the group, with his arm against his side, and his face doing its careful neutral thing. Nolan, I said. He looked at me. You should say what you think, I said. He thought for a moment. I think I want to go, he said. I think staying here indefinitely has a specific kind of slow motion problem that's harder to deal with than a specific problem you can move toward and try to solve. He looked at me when he said it. Both of us knew that the specific slow motion problem he was referencing was not only the food supply. Then we go, I said. Tommy made a sound that wasn't agreement and wasn't refusal. When? 5 days. To prep the truck and put together what we can carry. And to keep monitoring. If anything about the evacuation point changes, I want to know before we leave the mountain. He nodded. That was as close to full agreement as Tommy got on things he was ambivalent about. 5 days is a lot of time when you know what you're doing with it, and also not nearly enough. I transmitted. For the first time since the early days, I put out a real broadcast, not just on the ham calling frequency, but on the FM band, using the main transmitter. A strong signal, covering the area. I broadcast a survivor net, information about what I knew, what routes seemed viable, the evacuation point date and coordinates. Donna had asked me to relay. I relayed. I gave it 3 hours of broadcast time each day of the prep period, breaking it into morning and evening sessions. Responses came in. Not many. Most people with radio equipment weren't necessarily monitoring my FM frequency, but some. A small group of survivors about 12 miles west contacted me on the ham frequency, and I gave them everything I knew. They were 6 people in a farmhouse, good water, food for another 6 weeks. I gave them the evacuation information and the route advice, and told them to monitor for updates. They said they'd try. They sounded tired. 2 other contacts farther out that I probably can't verify anymore. Garrett and Nolan worked on the truck. The station truck was functional, but it hadn't been on a long run. They went through it. Fluids, belts, hoses, tire pressure. They found a slow leak in the rear left tire and patched it. They built a simple cargo rack extension on the truck bed, using angle iron and plywood from the station stores, expanding the effective cargo capacity without adding height that would make the vehicle awkward on narrow roads. Tommy mapped the route. He had paper maps, actual printed topographic maps, which he'd had in the truck since before everything, and he spent 2 days marking every road option between here and the evacuation point, identifying the sections where the Forest Service roads might let us bypass the most problematic sections of the primary highways. It was not a simple route. It involved a lot of smaller roads and some sections where the road quality was genuinely uncertain, but it avoided the areas I'd confirmed as dense with infected, and it avoided the known vehicle blockage points from the Hamnet reports. Faye packed food, systematically, with the same ledger energy she'd brought to everything. She divided the remaining store into what we were taking and what we were leaving, and she spent an hour arguing with herself about certain items before reaching decisions that I trusted entirely. She also packed the medication, all of it, with labels and notes, and put it in a case that she marked so clearly that anyone with reasonable literacy could use what was in it. Bridget packed her gear and Hex's gear, which was minimal and efficient in a way that told you she'd done a lot of backpacking and knew what actually mattered. I packed the radio equipment, the handheld scanner, the satellite communicator Tommy had, the ham handheld I'd had since my government days, extra batteries. I couldn't take the main console or the shortwave receiver. Too heavy, too fixed. Leaving the monitoring capability of the station behind was the hardest part of the preparation, not emotionally, practically. I'd been seeing the region through the station's ears for over 3 weeks. Going mobile meant going partially deaf, and I hated that. Lester watched all of this. He helped where he could. He was more physically capable than his age suggested, and he knew where things were in the building better than any of us. But he didn't pack a bag. On the 4th day of preparation, the morning of the 4th day, I realized he hadn't packed a bag. I went to him. "Are you coming?" He looked at me with that old, particular face of his. "I think I'll stay," he said. "Lester, we're leaving." "I know you are. The station doesn't need to be occupied. It'll run without someone here. You said yourself the module is automated. Someone should stay with it," he said. "In case someone needs it." He meant in case someone needed what I'd been providing. The relay, the information, the signal. If anyone came up the mountain looking for help and found the station empty, they'd have nothing. If someone was here, even an old man with old knees and a history with a government module in the equipment rack, they'd have something. I didn't argue with him. I didn't know how to argue with it. He wasn't wrong. I made sure he had enough food and propane to last months. I showed him the water filtration in more detail than he needed. He'd lived here. He knew it. I wrote down the encrypted channel frequency and the key sequence, and Donna's call sign, and told him how to reach her if he needed to. He thanked me with a nod, and that was the conversation. The night before we left, day 29 of the outbreak, I did a last full sweep of the radio, every frequency. My last comprehensive log entry from the station, what I heard. The FEMA evacuation broadcast was still running on its 4-hour cycle, unchanged. That was reassuring in a specific way. If the collection point had collapsed, the broadcast would presumably have changed or stopped. The amateur net was quieter than it had been a week ago. Some of the voices I'd been tracking as regular check-ins had stopped checking in. I didn't know what that meant. I logged it. The military encrypted traffic was still present. No further plain language lapses that gave me usable information. On 7.3 MHz, at 2:17 in the morning, the breathing signal appeared again. 11 minutes, same duration as before. I sat and listened to it and thought about Lester's explanation. The monitoring network, the atmospheric sensor, the data that someone somewhere was still collecting even now, and I couldn't decide if knowing the explanation made it less disturbing or more. At 3 in the morning, Bridget came and sat on the floor near the console with Hex in her lap and didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything, and we both just listened to the spectrum for a while. Eventually she said, "Do you think it's going to be okay?" "The evacuation point. I think it's real," I said. "Whether it's okay is a different question." "That's not very reassuring." "No," I said. She sat there a while longer. Then she said, "Hex hasn't barked this whole time. Not once." I noticed that. "She barked at Nolan on the second day," Bridget said. "Once. Just once. I thought it was nothing. She does that sometimes." I thought about that. She hasn't done it since? "No," Bridget said. "She just watches him." Morning. Last morning at the station. We loaded the truck. It took 2 hours because we were methodical about it. I wasn't going to be the person who rushed and left something important. The truck bed was full but not overloaded. Everyone had a bag. Hex was in Bridget's backpack, same as before. Tommy backed the truck out from behind the equipment shed and idled it near the main building while we did a final check. I went through the building one last time. I turned off what didn't need to run. I left the main antenna array connected and the secondary monitoring panel powered. Lester had asked me to leave it running. I left the motion sensors active. I left enough propane connected to the main feed to run the generator for months on low-use cycles. At the front, Lester was standing by the door. He handed me a paper, a handwritten note with a frequency and a time. "If you get somewhere with a decent receiver," he said, "try that at 0300. It's not always there, but when it is, it carries information I think you should have access to." "What kind of information?" "The kind that comes from people who built the network and then spent 20 years second-guessing whether they should have," he said. I put the paper in my notebook. We shook hands. His hand was dry and his grip was firm. I walked to the truck. Everyone was in. I had my hand on the door handle. He called out behind me, "Mr. Deering." I looked back. "They know the frequency," he said. "Whatever you broadcast from here, they've been logging it. Where it goes from here, that's your choice now, not theirs." I didn't ask who they were. I thought I knew enough to have a working hypothesis, and that was enough for a 300-mile drive. I got in the truck. Tommy was driving the first section because he knew the first section. The access road, the switchbacks, the soft shoulders, and the drop on the west side. I'd driven this road maybe 15 times now, and I knew it, but he knew it better. He took it slow. The gravel popped under the tires. Aspen stumps and brown scrub brush on either side. The sky was clear, and the light was early, and the peaks to the west had proper snow on them now. Real accumulation that had come down over the last week. I looked in the side mirror at the station building getting small behind us. The two towers against the sky, the main one tall, and the backup one shorter and never finished. The concrete block walls, the equipment shed roof, all of it getting small, and then getting smaller. Garrett was in the back seat next to Faye, who had her ankle wrapped, and was sitting sideways to keep it elevated. Bridget was against the other window with Hex making small movements in the backpack. Nolan was in the middle of the back seat. About 2 miles down the access road, on the section where the tree line opens and you can see the valley for the first time, Tommy stopped the truck, not because anything was on the road. He just stopped, and we all looked out at the valley below. The town of Ridgecrest was there. From up here you couldn't see the details of what it had become. It looked like a town. It looked like where people used to live, and in some version of the world still did. Tommy put the truck back in gear. We drove for maybe 10 minutes without anyone talking. Then Nolan shifted in the seat beside me. I'd moved to the back when Tommy took over, to be near the radio equipment, and he said, quietly, so that only I could really hear it, "My arm's been feeling strange for 3 days." He said it the way you say something when you've been holding it for a while and you're finally doing the thing you said you'd do. Factual. Direct. No drama. "Strange how?" I said. "Warm. The whole forearm. Not just at the wound. And sometimes I lose track of things. Just for a second. Like when you come up from being underwater, and there's a moment, before your ears clear." He looked at the window. "I'm not going to be a problem. You said to tell you if anything changed." "I know," I said. "I might be nothing," he said. "It might be a normal infection, bacterial, not." "I know," I said again. We drove down the mountain. The valley came up to meet us. Tommy took the south bypass route that avoided the main road through Ridgecrest and picked up the Forest Service road that would take us east, the long way around, the way that put the worst sections of infected density behind us before we even had to think about the highway. The truck hummed. The engine was running well. Garrett and Nolan had done good work on it. The road was rough but navigable. We had fuel and food, and Donna's frequency on the scanner, and 200 miles of unknown road ahead. I looked at Nolan. He was watching out the window with that careful, neutral face. Warm up the forearm. Brief lapses. 3 days. It might be bacterial. He might be nothing. And if the math on our supplies argued for going, and if the evacuation point was real, and the route was viable, and the people waiting there could provide the things we couldn't provide ourselves, on a mountain that was getting colder every week, then the math still held, even with a question mark in the back seat. What you do with question marks is you watch them, you pay attention, you don't look away. The access road met the county road at the bottom, and Tommy turned south without hesitating. Through the trees on the left, maybe 200 meters down the slope, I could see something moving between the trunks. Slow, not purposeful, going nowhere in particular, going toward nothing, going away from nothing. The trees slid past, and it was gone behind us. I turned around in the seat and looked up the mountain at where the station was. One more time, through the rear window. Just the treetops now. Just the ridgeline. Just the blue sky above the peaks, and the first real clouds of what was going to be a colder afternoon. I turned back around. The scanner in my lap was cycling through frequencies and producing the static hiss of the band, the chatter of a ham operator somewhere checking in on a net I hadn't cataloged yet, the thin sign of a carrier from somewhere, and underneath all of it that vast available silence of all the frequencies that nobody was using anymore. I tuned to Donna's channel. I said, "KD0RTL, this is W0CDR. We're mobile. We're headed south." Her response came back clear. "W0CDR, we have you. You have 12 days to the collection point. Be advised, The secondary forest route has a 6-hour travel day minimum. Take it slow. Don't stop anywhere with significant human population density. Make contact at 1800 each day. Copy that, I said. We have 6 people and a dog. Copy on the 6 and the dog. KD, 0 RTL clear. The road through the trees was dappled with morning light and shadow. Tommy drove with both hands on the wheel, watching the road, watching the tree line, watching the road again. Faye had her head back against the headrest and her eyes partially closed. Garrett was looking at the map on his lap, one finger tracing the route. Bridget had her hand in the backpack, stroking Hex in long, steady strokes. Nolan had his right hand over his left forearm, not holding it, just resting over it, like you'd hold something you were keeping warm. The scanner cycled through the empty parts of the spectrum and kept moving. Outside, the mountain began its slow disappearance behind us, giving way to the longer open country to the south. The road unrolling ahead, the day cold and clear, and the whole situation exactly what it was, uncertain in all the ways that mattered, and decided in all the ways that couldn't be undecided now. I pulled out the little wire-bound notebook and opened it to the back, to the page with the frequency Lester had given me. 0300 hours. The information that comes from people who built something and spent 20 years second-guessing it. I'd have time to listen for it. 12 days of driving, 12 evenings with the scanner, and whatever receiver we could access from the road. What you do with question marks is you watch them. I watched the road ahead, and kept the scanner running, and let the mountains fall away behind me, and didn't look back again.